Today we hear the second public lecture of our distinguished Randall Chair in Christian Culture, Dr. Ralph Wood. Normally, Dr. Wood resides at Baylor University of the great state of Texas, which is where I'm from, as a university professor of theology and literature. At this point in the year, it's a good idea to ask, at least I always do, why Providence College has a Randall Chair in Christian Culture. Perhaps many in the room didn't even know we did. Well, we do, so why? The obvious answer is because Father Robert Randall, a priest of the Diocese of Providence and a former Providence College professor, was able to raise the considerable funds it takes to have an endowed chair, the first and at this point the only such chair at Providence College, although I hear there's one coming, another one coming. The more interesting reason is that bringing distinguished Christian thinkers to our campus changes us for the better. This is about as true as it could be in the case of Dr. Wood. He has certainly brought sparkling intellectual and personal gifts to PC as the author of numerous well-received books on Flannery O'Connor, J.R.R. Tolkien, among others, and a soon-to-be published book on G.K. Chesterton entitled The Nightmare Goodness of God. Yet there is more. Dr. Wood, as well as his lovely wife, Suzanne, who's here, have thrown himself into our life with an abandon that bespeaks of that most Christian of convictions, that everything we have is a gift from God to be received with gratitude, and for that reason, with great and serious attention. Indeed, Providence College has been changed and will not be the same for their time with us, and for that, we must be ever grateful. Today, Dr. Wood will speak on two things much prized in these parts: rum, Romanism, and the sacramental imagination, as found in G.K. Chesterton's The Flying Inn. I will leave it to you to decide to which of the two I refer. Dr. Wood.
Thank you very much, Professor Keating. I've had a wonderful first term at Providence College, now well into second term. I've been delighted by the students who've been in my honors colloquium, and now again for a second colloquium, many of whom are here today, not under duress. I will not speculate about the others. Seriously, I am a bit chagrined that Father Shanley cannot be here. He is away because of a death. But I'm trying to convince Father Shanley that G.K. Chesterton is a very important Catholic writer. He's not thus persuaded, so I'm hoping that this lecture obviously won't, but my book might. I also bring you greetings from Father Randall, whom I had a letter from this week. He resides up here, as we call it, in the down south, the deep north, during the summer, but he flees to Florida during the winter. He brought me the very good news that his grandniece has just received a $50,000 scholarship to Baylor, and thus will be attending my university next autumn. So that came to me as a great bit of good news, so there will now be a kind of continuing symbiosis between Providence College and Baylor University. Today I want to talk about G.K. Chesterton, so let me do a quick hand showing of those of you who've read Chesterton. And it's no penalty if you haven't. Well, again, I am not preaching to the choir, and maybe I can stir in you an interest in him. As you notice on the outline, I call him the great fat man who got stuck in Harkins Hall. Chesterton made two visits to this country. I think the first time was 1926, and the second, if you'll look very carefully on the brochure, I don't have it on the handout, in 1930 when he came to Providence College. And I want to talk about initially who Chesterton is and what his work is about, and how he got stuck in Harkins Hall. You'll see that his dates are 1874 to 1936. He did not live long by our standards, 62 years. He did not become a convert to Christianity until he was in his 20s, and did not become a convert to Catholicism until he was in his 40s, though he had been calling himself a Catholic before being officially received into the church. He was indeed the most famous convert to Christianity, Catholic Christianity in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And he's still, of course, much debated, liked, and disliked on the American and European scene. And one thing that troubles me, and one reason I've written this book, is that Chesterton has bad admirers and bad despisers. There are those who think that Chesterton never said or wrote anything wrong, and thus have formed a kind of Chesterton cult. And they are out to, as it were, impose Chesterton as the absolutely unquestioned authority in modern apologetics. Well, Chesterton is wrong about a lot of things. In my book, I point out, among others, what I think to be his dreadful estimate of war, and not least of all, his serious misunderstanding of evolution. But today I'm not here to talk about those things, but about what he gets right. On the other hand, he has his, what I call, cultured despisers. Chesterton is roundly rejected in many intellectual circles, especially those who read The New Yorker, who had a journal that had a full-fledged attack on Chesterton a couple of years ago. They despise him in part because of those who like him so much. They assume if he's liked that much by those folks, then we don't like him. But they see him as a reactionary, as retrograde, as a throwback indeed to the 19th century, who is bringing forward a kind of Catholicism that's just the old story recooked. Well, it's not so. I can assure you it's not so. And so I encourage you to read among his 100 books and 1,200 essays. He was a journalist, by the way, an unapologetic journalist. The following four as the best places to begin Chesterton. I mention here Orthodoxy. That was the book that really has won him his greatest fame. It's probably the best place to begin. If you want to turn to his fiction, then read The Ball and the Cross. It is a splendid short novel, extraordinarily funny, as all of Chesterton's work is, but exceedingly incisive about the ills and ails of our age. Then if you want to read his greatest poem, I urge you to read, I don't have this one listed, so please record it. It could be a nice research essay, even this late in the semester. It's called The Ballad of the White Horse. The Ballad of the White Horse. A splendid, short epic. That's not an oxymoron. That will take you deep into Chesterton, deep into British history, but above all, deep into the relation of Christianity to modern culture. And then finally, if you want to read among his many, many books of essays, I would urge you to read the one called Heretics, early and yet quintessential Chesterton. So those four I would urge you to begin with, and then go further into the 100 that I assure you I have not read, much less the 1,400 essays, which, though I've dabbled in, I've hardly read in their entirety. When Chesterton came to this country in those two visits, he liked it very much. Chesterton was not a kind of fashionable anti-American. On the contrary, he was very greatly impressed with Catholic colleges and universities. Because, as you know, I trust you know, there were no such in England of his time. Catholics simply, though they'd just been fairly recently allowed to attend the public universities of Britain, now, by the time he came along fully fledged in their ability to do so, Catholics had no colleges of their own, or virtually none. Of course, there were seminaries for training priests, but there were no colleges. So Chesterton visited as many as he could. Most of them bestowed upon him honorary doctorates. I don't know, Jim, if Providence College did or not, but I know he made the rounds to Boston College, to Georgetown, certainly to Notre Dame, about which he wrote a very important poem called The Arena. And it's about the link between, get this, American football on the one hand and ancient fights in the Roman arena on the other hand. And you'll be glad to hear that football comes out ahead, though in a way that is not exactly like contemporary football, let us say the least. When he came to Providence College, I guess there was no space like this. I don't think Alumni Hall had been erected yet. So he spoke in the foyer of Harkins Hall. So I urge you to go over there and look at the place where he got stuck. Because Chesterton was 6'2" and weighed 320 pounds. No lightweight in any sense of the word was Chesterton. Well, by the time he came here, his knees had given away. He could no longer stand to give a lecture, and so he usually sat. In fact, when he began giving his lectures at Notre Dame, he got off one of his best lines. He always wore a cape. He always had his top hat. He always carried a cane, a sword stick, which if he pressed a button would bring a sword out the end. He loved medieval chivalry, obviously. But when he sat down at Notre Dame, not being able to stand for his lectures there, the microphones had just come into being. This was the first visit. And after he'd come in wearing that big cape, which made him look more like this than like that, he began his first sentence by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am not as large as I seem. This machine has magnified me, amplified me. He did, however, stand for his lecture, his presentation at Providence College. Holly Kuhlman and I think have figured out the niche in which he got stuck. So if you go into Harkins Hall, there in the foyer, go all the way to the very back of the foyer and look up, and there you'll see a Gothic niche in which Chesterton leaned in order to give his presentation and not have to have any support other than just the arch itself. However, he apparently leaned further and further back as the lecture proceeded so that when he finished, he couldn't pull himself out. And so he had to have aid in coming and pulling Chesterton out of that niche in Harkins Hall. So go there to have a look. Though Chesterton liked much about American culture, there's one thing he intensely disliked. And that's what this lecture is about today. Although be careful about getting your hopes up too quickly. He disliked prohibition. He disliked prohibition not only in this country, but also in his own native England, which of course was never there enacted, but had been proposed very vigorously. So that in 1914, when he wrote The Flying In, it was on the books as a possible enactment that, of course, this country would in fact go forward with in 1920, the great experiment, sometimes called the Great Disaster from 1920 until 1933. He disliked prohibition for a variety of reasons. Richard Hofstadter has often made what is, I think, the convincing consensus point, that is, that prohibition in America was, at its essence, the imposition of a rural Protestant pietism and moralism on an essentially urban Catholic populace. I think that thesis is pretty well uncontested. Everyone accepts it. But that was not Chesterton's chief objection. That's what I want to get at, why he disliked prohibition. And I've listed 3 of those reasons. I want to talk about them briefly before we look at the novel in itself. Chesterton was always a man who had what you Catholics call a preferential option for the poor. He believed that the glory of the Catholic Church is its refusal to turn away from and neglect the poor. He saw prohibition as the revolution of the rich and the powerful, none of whom, of course, gave up alcohol. It flowed freely among the wealthy, but it was an attempt to deny small pleasures to the poor. And in England, it was premised on the notion that if workers didn't drink so much alcohol, they would be much more productive for their employers. So it was not only an imposition of the wealthy upon the poor, but also an attempt to ratchet up the work ethic of the little people. And that troubled him very deeply. He thought that to take away the very small delights of poor people was an atrocity. But more than that, he saw prohibition as the beginning of the triumph of the modern nation state. In attending to the welfare of its people, on the premise, and here's what he really objects to, on the premise that the nation state takes precedence over the church, over the family, and over the home. Now, be sure you understand what I've just said. When Chesterton complains about the nation state taking precedence over the church and the family and the home, he's not talking about the public sphere taking over the private sphere. Don't misunderstand me. For Chesterton the Catholic, the church, the home, and the family are the real public sphere. That's where what Aristotle called the polis really takes place. And therefore the state should be subordinate to them, at least not in any way triumphant over them. And Chesterton had real contempt for what he saw as the emerging hegemony of the new, from the Enlightenment forward, nation state, whether it be from the left or from the right. Second point to get very clear about Chesterton and his politics. Chesterton had unbridled contempt for what most of us take for granted, namely capitalism without restraint. He thought capitalism was but the mirror image of socialism, and therefore he had deep, not just suspicion, but contempt for both. One of my former students, present students, who's actually in the room, I'm tempted to call his name, but I won't, came up to me last term and said, why are all these readers, all these writers in your course so consistently left in their politics, or at least in their economics? And I gave him what I thought was a very swift and short answer. I said, because they're Catholics who take social teachings, the encyclicals, the doctrines of the church with utmost seriousness. So did Chesterton. He is a lefty. Let's be very clear about that. Now, he's a lefty with a difference. He's not a socialist. He hates the way in which the modern socialist state was taking over the realm of what should be the public, but he also had extreme disregard for the profit motive. He felt the profit motive was based on the fundamental human inclination, which is for greed, and that capitalism is a form of gouging the neighbor. It fundamentally destroys cooperation, which for him, of course, should be the basis of society. So Chesterton saw prohibition as, again, the incursion of the modern state upon the true public realm, not upon the private realm. And therefore, he saw prohibition as a kind of example of that he ought to oppose. And so he does so in his novel called The Flying In. Now, a few words about the genre to which The Flying In belongs. It's very important to note that Chesterton has no regard for fictional realism. To him, realism was a type of art that is the ultimate bourgeois secular form. Because realism simply seeks to describe things as they are. Chesterton, as a visionary, did not want simply to describe things as they are, but things as they might be, as they ought to be, but not in a kind of preachifying fashion. Instead, he loved outrageous forms of art because it was his basic conviction that the most outrageous thing in the world is the gospel. And so he's drawn to farce. That's what The Flying In is. It is a wildly funny, fictional farce. Listen to what he said about those kinds of art forms that he was so deeply drawn to. I don't have it on this page, but listen to it. Of all the varied forms of the literature of joy, that's the key phrase, the literature of joy. And for him as a deeply Catholic Christian, the gospel is the great joyful good news. And to write about it, therefore, is not an easy task. He says, of all the varied forms of the literature of joy, the form most truly worthy of moral reverence and artistic ambition is the form called farce, or its wilder shape in pantomime. So when you read Chesterton's novels, think about pantomime, farce, things that are outrageous. Because for Chesterton, outrageous things, oddly enough, are the best way of understanding who God is and what God's will for the world is. For example, Chesterton believed that the modern horror, in all of its varied form, what Pope John Paul II called the culture of death, is fundamentally a failure of imagination. You may say, does he just mean there are not enough poets around? There are not enough creative writers around? What does he mean when he says the modern horror is largely the failure of imagination? What he means is that most of us have a fundamental inability to form right images, to discern true images, to wear the spectacles to see the world aright. So listen to what he says about that same phenomenon as he's attacking here Schopenhauer. Chesterton saw early on that nihilism was going to be the fundamental problem of modern life. He labeled Nietzsche from the beginning rightly, but I think Chesterton was actually quite perceptive to see Schopenhauer as a kind of forerunner of the later, really hard-nosed nihilist. This is what he says about Schopenhauer's famous essay entitled The Emptiness of Existence. Here's what he says. Schopenhauer had not that highest order of imagination which can see the things which surround us on every side with purified and primitive eyes. This is an early essay, and Chesterton had not yet learned to develop the term sacramental imagination. But that's what he's talking about. So let me alter that sentence by inserting that term. Schopenhauer, by which he means, of course, by extension, most of us, had not that highest order of imagination which can see the things which surround us on every side with a sacramental imagination. Had he possessed this, he would have felt, as we all dimly feel, that a child unborn offered the chance and risk of so vivid and magical an experience as human existence, could no more resist taking it than a living child could resist opening a cupboard in which he were told were toys of which he could not even dream. And by the way, Chesterton writes a very great poem called To a Child Unborn, where by his own imagination he tries to inhabit a child in the making, in its mother's womb, seeking to have life. And he goes on. Schopenhauer did not realize that the question of whether life contains a preponderance of joy or sorrow is entirely secondary to the fact that life is an experience of a unique and miraculous character, the idea of missing which would be intolerable if it were for one moment conceivable. Let me repeat that key phrase. The question is not whether life it has a preponderance of joy or sorrow, except one asks the primary question, makes the primary recognition that life is an experience of a unique and miraculous character. For Chesterton, you can't believe that, of course, unless you believe that life has a unique and miraculous source and sustenance in the triune God who has become flesh in Jesus Christ. So he writes the farce called The Flying Inn. Now the word flying here, you want to be careful about, does not mean the inn that flies in the air. He still is fully aware that the word flying meant fleeing. We're going to be talking about an inn that's on wheels. And by an inn, he means roughly what we would call a public house in Britain. A place where you go not to get any walking drunk, but to have convivial good times with your friends, to have conversation, to visit, and not least of all, to have a pub meal. When my wife and I travel in England, we always go to the pubs. That's the best, cheapest food around, a pub meal. And of course, an inn is a place where you could also spend the night. So an inn serves for Chesterton, this is a key, as a kind of far-off, distant gleam and echo of the church. So when we talk about this flying in, think about it in those terms. The whole novel centers around the following plot. Very simple. A man named Lord Philip Ivywood is a member of Parliament who has managed to get his fellow parliamentarians to pass a sumptuary law against the imbibing of alcohol in public places called inns. Because he is of the view that England will be a much more, notice well, efficient and hygienic culture if people will be prohibited from drinking alcohol. And the way he decides to do that, of course, is to simply shut down all of the inns. But he makes the following mistake. He says there will be a grandfather clause so that one can still serve alcohol under any inn sign until it's taken down, removed, confiscated. In other words, if you've got a sign declaring it, we shall see, these people do, the Old Ship, a British inn, you can still serve alcohol there until we come, confiscate it, take it down, alcohol is ruled out. Well, the innkeeper, a man named Humphrey Pump, great name, makes common cause with a British naval captain named Dalroy to remove that sign of the flying inn and to put it, automobiles were just in the making, put it in a carriage and take it about all of England, and wherever they would plant it, serving rum there and cheese. They take a huge round of cheddar cheese and a huge barrel of rum, and they flee all over England as the morality police are trying to chase them down and stop them from serving rum and cheese. They are, therefore, the flying in. Well, for Chesterton, the problem with Lord Ivywood, which he thinks to be the problem of much of modern culture concerning alcohol, is that he regards it as a medicine and not as what I'm making up as a word, a convivial, as a medicinal and not a convivial. So read with me, if you will, Chesterton's attack on that idea. It's the second quotation on the back side of your sheet. All the human things are more dangerous than anything that affects the beasts: sex, poetry, property, religion. The real case against drunkenness, this is where I think my Providence students will listen up, as I was told, now I assume this is simply rumor, that the Princeton Review ranked Providence College in the top 5 of alcohol, hard alcohol consumption. And I'm being told even maybe higher at the very top of the top 5. But let's assume for the moment that's only rumor, and therefore take Chesterton seriously. He says the real case against drunkenness is not that it calls up the beast, but that it calls up the devil. There is nothing bestial about intoxication. Animals don't get drunk. Man is always something worse or something better than an animal. Thus, in sex, for example, no animal is either chivalrous or obscene. And thus no animal ever invented anything so bad as drunkenness, or, note well, so good as drink. The dipsomaniac, the drunkard, and the abstainer, the teetotaler, are not only both mistaken, but they both make the same mistake. Here's the key. They both regard wine as a drug and not a drink. Then he adds, actually a different essay, Jesus Christ, referring, of course, to the great miracle of Cana in Galilee, made wine not a medicine, but a sacrament. Listen to this further declaration, not on your sheet, but even more powerful, perhaps. It's from his book called The Everlasting Man, a book that's often set alongside orthodoxy as the second great apologetic work. It's a stunning statement. There comes an hour in the afternoon when the child is tired of pretending, when he is weary of being a robber or a noble savage, and it is then that he torments the cat. There comes a time in the routine of an ordered civilization when the man is tired of playing at mythology and pretending that a tree is a maiden or that the moon made love to a man. And the effect of this staleness is everywhere the same. And notice, cultural staleness. That's what he's trying to address here. That cultural staleness is seen in all drug taking and dram drinking, alcohol, and every form of the tendency to increase the dose. What he's saying? We try to fill our massive boredom, illness, staleness, emptiness with a medicinal called drugs and alcohol, and then we increase the dosage. Men seek stranger sins or more startling obscenities as stimulants to their jaded sins. You've always got to ratchet up to the next road. From marijuana, you've got to go to cocaine. They seek after mad religions for the same reason. They try to stab their nerves to life as if it were with the knives of the priests of Baal. They are walking in their sleep and try to wake themselves up with nightmares. They walk in their sleep and try to wake themselves up with drunken nightmares. So Chesterton is no kind of enthusiast for unbridled drinking. Let's be very clear about that. He was not an alcoholic, as many writers are, but he's certainly no teetotaler either. Now, what turns out to be the case that makes this prohibition law frightening is that Lord Ivywood's getting the act passed prohibiting the serving of alcohol in Britain is part of a much grander scheme, a huge enterprise whereby he hopes to remake the entirety of British society. This is simply a small item within his grandiose plan. Let's read what that grandiose plan is in the fourth entry on your sheet. I hope you can hear how much there is of the American dream to start everything over again. Or think of Pol Pot in Cambodia, starting again with the year zero. This man is a cultured member of Parliament who has a similar idea. I would walk where no man has walked and find something beyond tears and laughter. He's echoing Nietzsche there. My road shall be my road indeed, and my adventures shall not be in the hedges and the gutters, but in the borders of the ever-advancing human brain. I will think what was unthinkable until I thought it. I will love what was never loved until I loved it. I will be as lonely as the first man. And of course, what Chesterton is doing there is echoing Nietzsche's idea of the last man. Because there's something profoundly inhuman about Lord Ivywood's entire experiment. And here's the point at which the book becomes very dangerous. We have to be honest about it. Lord Ivywood is inspired by a visiting prophet modeled on Rabindranath Tagore. Some of you will know that name, kind of an Indian mystic. But this man is a Muslim mystic. And when I mentioned that Chesterton has advocates of whom he would be ashamed, I need to make clear he has those who would turn him into the ultimate culture warrior and would have us therefore go out with an easy condemnation of Islam. That's not what's going on in this book. However, Lord Ivywood is inspired, and notice the name of the man he's inspired by, as I say there on the outline. His name is Mesisra Ammon. Not exactly sure what he's doing with that name, Mesisra Ammon, except Ammon is that region of modern-day Amman, Jordan, which was always the enemy territory of the Israelites. It was always the Ammonites and the Moabites that were enemies of Israel. And the Ammonites had Molech as one of their gods. Some of you will know that Molech, sometimes pronounced Moloch, was the god to whom babies were fed. Ate babies. Well, this man has a kind of abstract Islam that makes Lord Ivywood fill it with his own nihilistic ideas. So I want to get clear about Chesterton's real critique of Islam and not the artificial critique that we're going to all be blown up by Islamists, which we may be, of course, but that's not the point. Here's the point. And I don't think she's here today, but I owe much of my insight in this matter to a good conversation I've had with Sandra Keating. It's very, very clear about these matters. And that is the heart of Islam and its conflict with Christianity is that it is a deeply anti-sacramental religion. That is to say, the Quran makes it very clear that Allah could not become flesh. course, that is the very essence and heart of the Christian faith. So whatever dialogue we have with our Muslim friends, we'll have to take that into serious consideration. She's helped me see, for example, that it's not altogether appropriate to call Islam an Abrahamic faith. That's the common kind of parlance you hear. We have the three great Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. She's pointed out to me what I think is absolutely true. Abraham in the Quran does not play the role that Abraham does in Judaism or in Christianity. That is, Abraham is one who wrestles with God. Abraham is one who challenges God. Abraham is one who questions God. And that's not what is possible in Islam. My colleague, who's the Islamist at Baylor, points out the book of Job is unthinkable in Islam. You follow? The book of Job is 39 chapters of ranting and raving and screaming against the injustice of Yahweh. Not going to find anything like that in Islam. But the crux of the matter is for Chesterton, and I think it's for us, is that Islam, as this man, Misisra Aman, proclaims it, has no capacity to see God's relation to the world in a sacramental fashion, whereby we can make analogies of one thing with another, where we can see how God is like this, that, or the other. Not that any of those analogies nail God down, of course. On the contrary, we acknowledge always the utter inadequacy of those analogies. Nonetheless, our faith would be impossible without that sacramental imagination that enables us, for example, if we're faithful, to see every human being as a creature made in God's image. And therefore, you don't make them hungry. Therefore, you don't deprive them of medicine. Therefore, you don't abort them. Therefore, you don't kill them in war, any needless sort of way. Allah, says Chesterton, is so transcendent over the world that he can make no real contact with the world. And in that huge distance between Allah's total transcendence and human life as it's lived every day, there is a great void created that allows all kinds of pernicious things to enter. In fact, Chesterton says Islam is the greatest of all tautologies. God is God. That's the essence. God is God. A tautology, which of course is true, but finally, in a deep sense, empty. And so this man moves into that huge void and creates what is going to be an oppressive, modern, totalitarian state, unless he's stopped. And so one way of stopping it is to take the flying ships in sign on the road, fleeing from the morality police, and serving rum and cheese with wonderful drinking songs. So let's read a couple of the drinking songs on page 2. Backside. Remember, Chesterton loves the ballad meter, and the ballad meter is anapestic, da-da-dump, da-da-dump. So I will kill it the first time through so you can get the feeling of it. You will find me drinking rum like a sailor in a slum. You will find me drinking beer like a Bavarian. You will find me drinking gin in the lowest kind of bin because I am a rigid vegetarian. Now, Chesterton, you need to know, had contempt for vegetarians. Chesterton thought that red beef was one of God's great gifts to us. And he said in one of his most damning phrases, Americans are those people who regard smoking and drinking as vices. By which he meant, to get clear, vices are 7 deadly, mortal sins: anger, avarice, lust, pride, gluttony. What have I left out? What? Envy. Those are vices, things that will really undo you, but Americans often exalt them to alcohol and tobacco. So they sing these wonderful drinking songs, making fun of the fact that, after all, rum is not of fauna, but of flora. Listen to the next one. No more the milk of cows shall pollute my private house than the milk of the wild mares of the barbarian. I will stick to port and sherry, for they are so very, very, so very, very, very vegetarian. I think the best poem in The Flying Inn is the one called The Rolling English Road. Because it's much more than simply a description of the way in which English roads are like cowpaths. You've all been there. No English city, no English pathway is laid out on a grid the way so many American cities and highways run. Providence is a nice exception to that rule. We get lost all the time because roads they cross back on each other. Well, this is a poem about how maybe this got started in England as a man walking home a little tipsy was chased for his sin by the parson, by the church sexton, and finally by the squire who owned the thing, so that when he finally got home, look what a circuitous route he had taken. But the deeper point is that for Chesterton, that's life. Life is not a matter of square advances down straight lines. Life is a matter of circuitry, of going forward, going backward, going around, so that we get there only when we've passed through the right things. So this is the rolling English road. It's there on your sheet. Before the Romans came to Rye, or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. A reeling road, a rolling road that rambles round the shire. And after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such as we did tread that night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. Well, you know, Birmingham is in the north of England. Beachy Head, as I say, are those great chalk cliffs on the southern English coast. The second stanza is even better. My friends, we will not go again or ape an ancient rage or stretch the folly of our youth, which may have to do with alcohol, by the way, I don't know, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light. This is a great phrase, the decent end of death. For there is good news yet to hear and fine things to be seen before we go to paradise by Kensal Green, by way of Kensal Green. And Kensal Green, as I suggest, as I say there, is a cemetery. So you don't get to paradise but by way of death, and death after following a very winding and crooked road. Well, here's where things then wind up. In a huge contest between, on the one hand, Lord Ivywood, who is vying for the affections of Lady Joan Brett, because he offers her everything. He offers her palatial existence. He offers her a house so fancy and with so many rooms, it's like an American plutocrat's mansion. But she has fallen in love early in life with a man named Patrick Dalroy, who's been away at sea, who's been off with the Navy, but who's come back home and has renewed his love for Lady Joan Brett. And so she's caught in the middle between whether she will cast her life with the great comfort, supposedly of living with Lord Ivywood, or whether with Patrick Dalroy in an ordinary, humble marriage. And of course, you can imagine where things are going to turn out. For Chesterton, the essence of the Christian comedy is that it always opens out to life. The essence of tragedy, which of course we Christians fully acknowledge, is that it always closes down to death. New Testament, of course, is the ultimately comic book. It opens out in the book of Revelation to a marriage, the marriage feast of the Lamb. The book ends, therefore, in the great triumph of Captain Dalroy meeting back again his love, Lady Brett, winning her hand and ending in marriage. However, it's not an unqualified triumph, because the last words of the novel are about the fate of Lord Ivywood. Lord Ivywood becomes so turned in upon himself with his self-consuming nihilism that he winds up in total madness, which, if you read Orthodoxy, is Chesterton's basic conviction about the state of the modern mind. It's usually a form of madness. But rather than ending on that rather dire note, I want to end with his friend Hilaire Belloc's great poem, epic poem in praise of wine. It's obviously a much longer poem. I'm ending simply with the last lines. Now note well, wine here becomes sacramental. Wine here is more than a convivial. Wine is here the blood of our Lord. And therefore, listen to what he pleads for in death. But when the hour of mine adventures near, just and benignant let my youth appear, bearing a chalice, open, golden, wide, with benediction graven on its side. So touch my dying lip, so bridge that deep, so pledge my waking from the gift of sleep. Whom is he addressing? This is the key. Whom is he addressing? Christ. And sacramental, raise me the divine. You, implied, strong brother in God and last companion, wine. Splendid final poem. Let's not end quite so heavily, but instead with that great ditty. Wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. At least I've found it, always found it so. Benedicamus Domino. Thank you very much.
Why don't we have a couple of minutes of questions, not too long. I think maybe just a couple of questions, like 5 minutes maybe. I'll call on them. Tony, all right.
Professor Estlin is referring to a wonderful passage in Orthodoxy, the very first chapter, which is called The Modern Maniac. And there he's making the case that the madman is not the one who's lost his mind or his reason. For if you grant the madman his premise, everything follows. If you've known anyone who is insane, it's been my misfortune to have done that. They have utter consistency in what they believe. Because, as Chesterton says, they've lost everything but reason understood in a totally truncated, totally emasculated, totally shrunken way that's absolutely anti-sacramental, is rationalistic, and cannot be comprehended in the rich Thomistic way of reason as that which, of course, leads us to God. Well, you've been very attentive, and you stayed very late.
Yeah.